Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming from. Thank you for joining us today to talk about WatchGuard's Internet Security Report for Q3 2022. First, I think it's still okay to say Happy New Year. We may not have seen you, at least Mark and I haven't, since last year. The Q3 report is a little later than average for us to do the webinar for it because we did release it back in December, did a podcast, but today we get to talk about the results of what happened in Q3 so that you can prepare your defenses. So looking forward to talking about the report. Before we start, my name's Corey Knockreiner. I'm currently the Chief Security Officer of WatchGuard Technology. I've been the CTO in the past. And among running security for WatchGuard, me and my team, which you'll find out Mark is a key person in that security team, run the WatchGuard Threat Lab. But with that, let me hand it over to Mark to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. And again, thanks everyone for hopping on too. Like Corey said, I work under him and we run both internal security at WatchGuard, so keeping us safe from the bad guys out there, but also leading the threat research arm of WatchGuard, what we call the Threat Lab. That side is where we get all the fun, interesting data, get to do cool research projects, but really our day-to-day job is just to keep our finger on the pulse of security so we can paint a picture of what the threat landscape is out there for small and mid-sized organizations and MSPs and MSSPs that manage them. And as part of that action, we take all of the data we receive from Firebox appliances that have opted into sharing it with us. We'll get into a little bit more on that later, and turn it around into these reports every quarter where we can show you specific trends and threats and threat actor activity that we've seen over the quarter targeting organizations like you. But it's not just us that runs all of this. We've got a whole team behind the scenes that helps contribute to the report, and our day-to-day operations on the Threat Lab side really would not be able to get this thing cranked out at all every single quarter if it weren't for the rest of our co-authors too on our team.
I will say you and I started this report and we did at least a year and a half where it literally was you and me as writers, but we didn't have all the additional responsibilities we have today. So thank goodness for all the additional writers, and they bring some extra content too with their background in the products they focus on.
Absolutely.
With that said, the agenda today is pretty typical for the Internet Security Report. Mark gave you a taste of it, but this report is really generated by various products of WatchGuard. When you opt into sharing data, and Mark will talk a little bit about that in a second, we get data from things like our network security appliance, the Firebox. So for instance, we'll start by talking about what the Firebox saw, both this top malicious malware and also top network attacks and the types of domains users were accidentally going to that we blocked. But we also have stuff from our endpoint products, WatchGuard EPDR or Adaptive Defense 360. So we give you an idea of some of the endpoint trends. Every quarter, we try to either do a research project or dive deep into a big incident. This quarter, we talk about evil proxy adversary in the middle attacks, which Mark wrote about. And of course, the whole point of all of this isn't just to show what the attackers are doing for fun, but really to learn from the attackers. The intro to this report talked about how man plans and God laughs. We all plan our security defense, but as we try to defend ourselves, attackers react and do new things. So we need backup plans, and it's always good to know what the latest trends are so that we can adjust our defenses. But with that said, let's jump right into the first section, which covers what our network security appliances or fireboxes see out in the threat landscape. And with that, Mark can tell you a little bit more about what the Firebox feed covers.
Yeah, and I'm sure quite a few of you have probably been to one of our previous webinars on security reports, so this will be a bit of a refresher for you. But for those that are new, we have what we call our Firebox appliance, basically a UTM, NGFW, whatever Gartner buzzword you want to throw on it, that we have deployed around the world on our customers' networks. And if you manage one of these devices, you've got a little checkbox in the device settings that lets you send feedback back to WatchGuard. That includes some usage telemetry, like what services you have turned on within the appliance itself to help product management and engineering figure out what areas they should target next. But on the threat side, we also get telemetry back anytime the device blocks a threat from one of its security services. And by having the more people that opt into sharing this data with us, obviously the more statistically accurate picture we're able to paint of the threat landscape. So I encourage you, if you manage a Firebox appliance or you've got an MSP or MSSP that manages your appliance, please consider enabling that checkbox. It is all anonymized by the time it gets back to us and really helps make this report useful with the data we can give back to you. So of the information that we pull in what we call the Firebox feed, it includes telemetry from the 3 main anti-malware engines running on the appliance. So there's the signature-based Gateway Antivirus. It does a really good job of quickly catching the known threats that are out there. But as you'll see later in this webinar, signature-based anti-malware services aren't sufficient just on their own to catch all of the threats that we see. So backing that up, we have 2 additional layers of anti-malware that report in. Intelligent AV, which uses a machine learning AI model to predict quickly whether something is good or bad. And then APT Blocker, which is a cloud-based behavioral sandbox engine that will take a malware payload, send it to the secure cloud sandbox and detonate it and just watch the behaviors to ultimately make a determination of whether it's good or bad. Outside of anti-malware, we also have the Intrusion Protection Service, or IPS, which is mainly looking for network-based exploits, targeting both servers and clients. So it's not just protecting your web server that you're hosting inbound traffic to, but also your clients and applications that make connections out to network-based services as well too. And then we also, rounding it out, have the DNS Watch section, which is a DNS firewalling service mainly designed to protect against happy clickers, as we call them, folks that fall for a potential phishing message, click the link, and instead of being sent to the malicious destination, DNS Watch can redirect them to a secure black hole too. But as you'll see later in this webinar, it's not just phishing protection too. We also catch a lot of malware command and control beaconing and distribution domains as well too, which we'll discuss later on in this report. So all of this coming together though is what we call the Firebox feed. And again, it's really built off of the information that's anonymized that you share with us, and really do encourage you opting into sharing that if you have the power to do so.
Cool. So with that, let's talk about the quick high-level highlights of what we saw in the Firebox feed. And this slide represents all of that. I'll start by saying generally everything was down. If you combine all of our anti-malware services, malware was down just quarter over quarter between Q2 and Q3. And later on, when we talk about network attacks also were down. But here you can kind of see we are seeing more Fireboxes reporting in, which is good. Hopefully people have listened to Mark asking for people to opt in. So we had over 82,000 Fireboxes sharing this data. By the way, that's still a fraction of active Fireboxes. There's probably around 400,000 active ones out there. So it's definitely not all of our boxes reporting in, but more in this report than some. Gateway Antivirus, which is the one that's mostly signature based, malware was up a little bit for Gateway Antivirus detection. So that 12.3 million does represent a 6% increase of just plain Jane, easy to detect signature based, malware that signatures can catch in Q3. However, the big drop that caused overall malware to drop quite a bit was evasive malware was only 4.9 million, which is a 23% decrease over the quarter before. So on one hand, it's pretty nice to see less evasive and more sophisticated malware that evades signatures. So overall, it was down. As you can see, that evasive malware, we have a term we call zero-day malware. We say this every time, but it's very different than a zero-day exploit, which is an unpatched flaw. To us, zero-day malware is the type of malware that a signature hasn't been made for yet. It's either polymorphic malware that's using packing encrypting to make it seem new every time, at least from a signature perspective. So it requires some more proactive detection, like behavioral-based detection or machine learning, being able to see things that average humans can't and to detect it. Overall, this was one of the lowest quarters we've seen in the past 2 years for zero-day malware. Only half of malware bypass signatures in Q3. Now I say only because that's grown as high as just under 75%, so it's usually pretty high. But still remember, that means half of the malware coming to your network is not going to be caught by the average signature-based detection. So it still does push the need that you should have some sort of better proactive way to catch malware. One stat you don't see on this slide, but we also do talk about malware or attacks that are being detected only if you're inspecting encrypted traffic. So whether that be gateway antivirus over TLS. TLS, by the way, is just the way, we encrypt web traffic. Used to be SSL, now TLS is more secure. 72% of the encrypted traffic we saw was zero-day malware, though. So one trend is when bad guys are using encrypted traffic to get their malware into your network, which is becoming very, very common because it's a way to evade a lot of defenses if people are not using HTTPS or TLS inspection. Well, when they are sending traffic over these encrypted connections, more often than not, it seems to be the more sophisticated variant. By the way, we'll talk about it later, but a core belief of mine in this report that we're starting to get signs of, but can't prove 100% scientifically yet, is I believe there's a lot more malware out there than we can show you in the report because so few people are actually decrypting TLS traffic. I would say on average, probably only 20% of the fireboxes reporting in are doing TLS decryption. And later on, we'll talk about a particular malware variant and how it shows that probably most of the threats are coming through TLS. And as a result, because only 20% of our users reporting in are inspecting it, we're probably not seeing a lot of the attack surface out there. But before we dive into that, I'll hand it over to Mark to talk about our first list, which is the top 10 list.
Yeah, so if you take a look through the report, we try and break out the data that we get in a few different views, one of them being just the top overall malware by volume. So these are the threats that had the most detections by volume across our customer base out there that are reporting it. And if you take a quick glance at this list, one thing you'll notice is that all of them are some form of first stage malware, as we call it. They're the droppers, the code injectors, or the Office exploit that kicks off the malware infection on a endpoint. And this is because where the firebox sits in the cyber kill chain, sitting at the perimeter, it's at a really good position to catch these very first stages of a malware attack. Whereas endpoint detections, which we'll get into a little bit later, we tend to see the latter stages of the attack on the endpoint. So this quarter, we actually had 4-ish new variants pop up in the top malware. I say ish because a few of them have shown up in previous lists in previous quarters, whether it be our top 5 malware over encrypted connections or our top 5 most widespread malware, which are the threats impacting the most individual networks. But for this quarter, there were a few standouts. I'm not going to spill the beans on all of them because we're going to go into a bit more detail on a few, like Agent IIQ and Fugrafo a little bit later. But for the other ones, you'll notice a lot of Office exploits as well, too. So even though Microsoft has done a pretty fantastic job over the last year of making it more difficult to successfully send a malicious Office document to a victim and have them execute potentially malicious code in it, it's still not perfect. Like the reality that we're in right now is not everyone keeps their Office up to date. Not everyone has the correct settings within their domain or their machine to correctly block a lot of these threats. And so Office documents remain a very popular avenue for attack from threat actors. And they can often kick off what are called fileless malware attacks or living off the land attacks, where all it takes is opening up that Word doc, clicking the enable content button. And at that point, a threat actor can use the tools built into your machine like PowerShell to fly entirely under the radar without dropping any other payloads on your storage device itself and instead run entirely in memory. A lot of code injection threats out there this quarter too. These are the types of droppers that will take some form of payload and inject it into another process as well as another form of trying to evade endpoint protections. But I mean, with that, let's go ahead and hop and take a look at the top encrypted malware because there's actually some really interesting trends out of there too.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that one trend, but we got a question, Mark, already that I think just because you mentioned living off the land attacks, it could explain one thing. But one of the listeners mentioned that a new book was published called Hacking Kubernetes. But aside from Kubernetes and how you hack it, in the book, a claim was made that they're seeing less rats. And for the listeners out there, RAT stands for Remote Access Trojan. So basically just something that will put a backdoor on a client and gives an external threat actor remote access to it. So basically the question mark, and I'm not sure if we will have quantifiable data to talk about this, but the listener was asking, do we agree with the assessment that there seems to be less rats? So the book apparently claims the amount of rats out there is lowering. I don't, we certainly still see plenty of Trojans. You can see some even on this list. By the way, I will mention one of the things in the top 10, it's at the bottom, but we've mentioned Emotet for many reports. We keep mentioning it because a while back, authorities took down the main Emotet command and control, but we predicted it would come back. At the, at the most base level, Emotet is a Trojan. I guess the question is, do you consider a rat different than a botnet? Both of them are remote access Trojans. I guess if I were to define a difference, rat is probably something you control one victim at a time, whereas a botnet's designed to control many. But Mark, do you have any thoughts on if rats are going down? I thought if they were, the one thing to talk about is living off the land attacks. So this fileless malware where you're not doing a dropper is going up. And the reason it's going up is that threat actors find, there are ways to detect living off the land techniques, but it's harder if you don't have EDR solutions. So maybe rats could be going down because living off the land techniques are going up. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Without having seen the report that originates this data, my first thought though is exactly the same line that you said, and that these days a lot of these what used to be really sophisticated living off the land techniques are entirely commoditized now. There's entire toolkits that you can get for free, like Powersploit and Powerware, even more sophisticated tools that you can buy or license on underground forums that make it so some of these more sophisticated attacks that are entirely memory based, they aren't dropping a malware Trojan on your hard drive at all, can be easy for even low skilled attackers out there. And so my first hot take is that maybe remote access Trojans in its traditional sense as a malware executable saved to your storage device and run from there, maybe they are going down. But the same style of behavior is probably just enabled through other means now that are significantly more difficult to detect if you don't have the right tools.
Yep, that's kind of my thought. But we do still see rats occasionally in our top list too, though. So let's move, like Mark said, to our next list, which is top malware base that's encrypted. Now, the first thing I want to mention right away is, as I mentioned before, only about 20 of those 82,000 boxes, only about 20% are actually feeding this list, or are actually analyzing encrypted data so that we can see this. And right away, the top threat through encryption is Agent IIQ. I'll talk more about what that dropper does in a second, but that was the #1 encrypted threat. But look at the count, the encryption count, 334,000. If we go back to the top 10 list, it is #3 on the top 10 list with the exact same count. That means, just so you know, when you look at this top 10 list, it includes both encrypted and unencrypted malware. We put it all together. But the point I'm trying to make is 100% of Agent IIQ's detections were over encrypted channels, which are only supplied to us by 20% of the boxes recording in. And this is why I say, until more users start to inspect encrypted traffic, our top 10 probably is significantly different in reality if you could actually see all the encrypted traffic from all the fireboxes out there. Because if only 20% got Agent IQ to #3 spot, imagine if all their boxes reported in, I suspect that would easily be the #1 malware. And what else is hiding in that encrypted traffic? So I'll talk about what Agent IQ is in a second, but as you can see, there's also a HTML phishing Trojan, some malicious JavaScript. There's a lot going on in encrypted traffic. And if you can't tell, I think it's very valuable to enable encrypted inspection on your Firebox. It's a free feature. You don't even have to buy premium services like Total Security in order to do this. Any Firebox has this capability, and you're missing a lot. And by extension, I'm starting to think that until more people show encrypted traffic, even some of our non-encrypted results in this report may not show the perfectly accurate picture, because we see a much different picture once we see inside encrypted traffic. Having said that, let's jump into some of the malware standouts. Which one was this Agent IQ? Again, it hit top 3 malware completely through encrypted traffic only, so it's probably even more prevalent than we know. That said, what does this dropper do? It actually is a phishing toolkit for Google and Office or Microsoft 365 logins. So at the end of the day, this installs stuff that will help folks, phishers, create a page that looks very much like a Google login or a Office login to help phish connections. So a big Trojan. The other one Mark mentioned was Variant Fugrafa. Fugrafa, I think is how you might pronounce that, which hit number 8. This is a code injection malware that actually arrives as a Minecraft cheat engine. Basically, my daughter's a Minecraft player, someone I don't think who cheats, but if you look online, Vape is a very popular Minecraft cheat engine, and this is being spread on a Discord. If you join kind of unsavory Discords that maybe talk about Minecraft cheating, you can get a version of Vape Client 4, which basically has been injected with some additional malware, which turns out just to be a coin miner. So I guess not the most threatening thing in the world, but still something you do not want to have. And that, by the way, remains a theme. A lot of technical folks, at least in their young childish days, might have pirated something in the past, but as free as that seems as a kid, besides being obviously illegal, piracy is rarely free. There's usually an ulterior motive for why people are sometimes offering things like cracks. By the way, another top malware variant we saw also came through piracy rather than being a Minecraft cheat engine. I think this one was a crack for a 4K downloader, for a popular YouTube downloader, but this was a crack for that software, which also included malware.
Was number 10 on the list, Agent FZUW, which the majority of the detections we saw came as a file called 4K video downloader.exe. So really popular avenue for getting malware onto machines.
By the way, it's there's nothing wrong with that program, but it's kind of trialware until you buy it. And so if you're seeing a cracked version of it, that's where you definitely want to be careful.
Yep.
Cool. And I'll hand it to you to talk a little bit about regions. Or actually, no, let me quickly cover this and I'll let you do network attacks. But this shows kind of the regional distribution of malware. As you can see, most of our detections were in the European, Middle East, and Africa region. We haven't been able to find, sometimes if you go to our most widespread malware list, we have more specific regional information for country for certain threats, but it's hard for us to find actual quantifiable reasons why malware is distributed a little bit different from our view every quarter. EMEA has become popular for I think the past year or so has been the top spot where we see most malware. And we do, by the way, normalize this for fireboxes because we may sell a certain number of devices more in one region versus another. We obviously don't want just our sales to be affecting where we see things. So do know that we do normalize this based on fireboxes. So if you're living in the European area, you definitely want to have all 3 anti-malware services enabled. With that, I'll hand it off to you to talk about network attacks, and I'll look at some of the questions, Mark.
Yeah, and right off the bat, you can see an interesting trend that's kind of materialized over the past few quarters, where network attack detections have actually trended downward in the past couple of quarters. In fact, compared to Q2, there was a 46% decrease from the last quarter, and that's down 77% from the year prior. And a lot of this, which we'll get into in a second, kind of hinges on the fact that the top 10 network detections we see every quarter account for the overall majority of total detections that we see every quarter. So when it comes to network attacks, so things detected by our IPS engine, we tend to see this really lopsided, like 10 to 15 or so threats, accounting for the overwhelming majority of detections out there. And we kind of chalk this up to scanning engines and automated tools trying to pick some of the more popular or potentially exploitable vulnerabilities and trying
Or
them
ones
against
that
wide
just are
swaths of
built
the
into
internet.
toolkits. Like some of
Yep.
them, the oldest vulnerabilities, there's an exploit that has probably existed in the exploit pack for the past 3 years. So it's just an easy exploit that's already there that they can just launch as part of
Yep.
a
And so when there's a change in one of these detections, like a decrease, or maybe they pull it out of the tool, there tends to be a pretty wide fluctuation in overall volume of network attacks we see too.
I mentioned this in my intro too, by the way, but I think this is also perhaps suffering from the TLS HTTPS effect. So remember, IPS can also work over non-encrypted and encrypted traffic, but if you're not doing TLS decryption, attacks that are happening over secure websites are not going to show up in IPS detections. One other thing you'll see, in fact, if I don't know if you're done with this slide, but I'll transition. I can go back if you need, Mark.
Mhm.
But when we do, Mark will cover the top network attacks. But if you glance at this, one common theme every quarter is they're all web-based attacks. And guess what? Like 95, I don't know what the official number is, but almost every website we go to nowadays is encrypted. So it makes sense that IPS is also going to show less and less until you start to look at IPS over that's being decrypted by TLS. So I also think because again, only about 20% of the people reporting in are doing TLS inspection. So the majority of our IPS detections that we're seeing to be able to make this report is unencrypted traffic. I think a lot of what's really happening in network attacks could be hidden by TLS.
This list actually doesn't tend to change very often. We've had some quarters with only like one, sometimes even zero new additions to it. So three new ones popping up is actually pretty interesting for this last quarter. One of them, if you're looking close towards the bottom there, is one that we really expected to show up, and I honestly expected to show up a bit quicker than it did. That's number 8 in the list if my math is correct, and it's CVE 2021-26855, or as it's more colloquially called, proxy logon. If you remember back in, man, was it December 2021, when a few chain vulnerabilities were disclosed and ultimately exploited fairly rapidly across any exposed Exchange server out there, basically gives full remote code execution to a lot of these Exchange servers that are still floating around. Some of the other ones that you see are just variants of SQL injection detection signatures and directory traversal detection signatures out there. A lot of the threats that we see or are able to detect are we catch using some of these more generalized detection signatures that look for common types of web-based attacks against servers and services. One of the trends that we highlight in the report is we still see a lot of attacks against SCADA systems and other OT technology or IT controlling OT tools out there. You can draw parallels to some of the geopolitical activity that we see around the world and understand why attacks against operational technology would be beneficial for some threat actors out there and potentially nation states too. But overall, these main top 10 detections accounted for the vast majority of the threats that we saw out there for the quarter. And again, it's because a lot of these are really easy to automate within tools. And these days, I think you can fingerprint the entirety of the internet in like less than a day on modern hardware with some of the tools that we see out there. And it makes it really easy to identify vulnerable systems, either through your own searching or with tools like Shodan or Census.io, and then go try some of these vulnerabilities against them quite rapidly too.
Yeah, it's trivial to find target servers nowadays. Uh,
Mhm.
and by the way, trying to answer a few questions while we're talking. One was from a little bit ago when we were talking about commercial versus trialware YouTube downloaders. And there was a general question of why would someone try to crack something like 4K downloader when there's open source options probably that you can find on GitHub. I would just probably personally answer Google. I think smart folk, technically savvy folks like you, the person that asked this, or me or Mark, we would probably go deeper than Google's first page results. which are probably affected by marketing and stuff. So I think a lot of the GitHubs that might have free and useful things that are helpful don't always come up in the first results. Whereas if you search the best downloader, you might quickly get an advertisement for 4K YouTube downloader, and then when you realize it's trialware, that's probably when someone tries to crack it.
That's a really good point. Like, I tend to throw my parents under the bus in these webinars when I try and pick out examples. This time I'm going to throw my siblings under the bus. And that, if I were to go out and look for something to help me go download YouTube videos, I would absolutely look for open source projects that I know, potentially even compile it locally myself. My siblings are not going to do that. They're going to Google YouTube downloader, pick whatever the top result is. Maybe they understand some look sketchier than others, and they'll go for the second one. But that's the extent
with you after all. They have to know a little.
Exactly, but that's what the overwhelming majority of people out there are going to do. They're going to search for what they are trying to find, and threat actors can even seed those search results to have their malicious software indexed higher than the legitimate versions of the exact same software sometimes too. So that's why we see a lot of these detections pop up, because while you listening to this webinar right now probably are a technical individual, or at least interested in cybersecurity, the majority of the population out there is not. And that's where we get a lot of these clicks come from.
Definitely. And by the way, there was one other question, since we've been talking so much about TLS inspection. One person mentioned that they use it, but they often have to play with packet filters and other exceptions to get past certain things that break. We're not going to answer that right this second, but trust me, HTTPS is in our defense section. So when we talk about that as one last opportunity to make sure people turn it on, we will talk about how the challenges to using it as well. So keep listening, and we'll make sure to talk about that in the defense section. So regionally, looking at network attacks, so IPS versus malware, it's much more what I'll call a peanut butter spread. Well, I guess in this case, EMEA is the one that receives the least. If you look generally, the network attacks generally happened on just about the same amount everywhere. Not exactly 33% everywhere. America's got a little more, EMEA a little less. But overall, there was no one region that had most of these network attacks. And in the corner there, you can see what this translates per firebox. So on average, your firebox is blocking 400 to 600 network attacks that are hitting it externally every quarter.
Yeah, and so with our DNS firewalling service, DNS Watch, we've got a wide number of categories that we can ultimately categorize a threat and block it. Whether it be a phishing website that a user may go to or something distributing malware. In this report, we highlight the three main security-related categories that we're most concerned with and bucket them into compromised websites. So these are legitimate websites that have been compromised by some vulnerability on them and used to host illegitimate traffic or malicious payloads on them. Malware websites, so these are domains that are primarily set up to distribute or act as a command and control connection for malware. And then phishing websites, which are, as you might guess, websites associated with phishing activity trying to steal credentials. And in this quarter, one trend that really stuck out in the malware domains was that we saw a lot of malware domains distributing what was called lemon duck malware. So lemon duck's been around for quite some time. It's a pretty traditional botnet Trojan style threat. It can be distributed over a few different ways. We've seen other reports of it being distributed over physical media. So think a tainted USB thumb drive that shows up at one of your employees' homes and they go, oh, look, free thumb drive, and plug it into their computer. And if you don't have your settings set correctly in Windows, or they get social engineered into clicking a file in there, it can kick off a lemon duck infection. But we also see it being delivered through traditional malware domains too. So whether that be a drive-by download or tricking a user into trying to download illegitimate software like we just discussed too, can end up with an infection also. We also saw Emotet, which we've mentioned a few times, continue to not necessarily surge back, but still stick around despite attempts to disrupt its activity. The pstests.ru domain was primarily associated with Emotet distribution. And then one thing that I think we've pointed out a few times before, but I wanted to highlight again in the phishing domains, is you'll notice the top 3 domains in there are all associated with SharePoint.com. So within Microsoft's cloud and Office 365, you can host whatever kind of files you want. And you can set up storage buckets and register your own subdomain for them as well too. And what this ultimately leads to is phishing websites. So if you go to navigate them, they look like an Office 365 login form hosted on a SharePoint subdomain. So if your users are just hovering over the link and seeing, oh, sharepoint.com, that must be legitimate, they can fall for these phishing attacks because of these cloud hosted storage solutions. And so what this means is while we have technical tools like DNS Watch capable of catching these threats, you can't rely entirely on your technical tool set, and you need to make sure you're still educating your users to treat everything with skepticism that they receive in their inbox and their text messaging as well too these days. So making sure that they don't just assume because it is a Microsoft owned or a Google owned domain that it's going to be legitimate, and that they instead treat it with skepticism. If it pops up a login form and they weren't expecting, maybe don't go enter in your username and password because as we'll discuss in a couple of sections here, that can even lead to getting access to your account and circumventing multi-factor authentication as well too with some of the new tool sets that we see out there that threat actors are using. So with that, we can pivot into the key takeaways unless any other questions popped up, Corey.
No, so let's just jump in and I'll take the first and you can talk about Lemon Duck. We kind of already mentioned the first. Remember that free is often as in free malware. So this is again about piracy or even about from a mobile perspective, downloading apps from, non-sanctioned repositories or any place besides the Apple Store or the Google Play Store or whatever they call it now. Piracy is illegal. You shouldn't pirate. I do think it's good to pay for people that make things. There's a lot of reasons you might have done it in the past once in a while, but realize that this piracy is usually not entirely free. Bad guys are out there. If they're putting their apps or a copy of Angry Birds on a third-party app, repository that you can get for free, there's a good chance you're getting something else with it. If there's cracker software for all the trialware out there, you never know what might be in that cracker software besides it being able to generate keys. And as you saw with the Vape4 Minecraft cheat, bad guys like to add additional or inject malware in packages that are popular with people. So besides just the legality of it, remember free isn't often free. Why don't you go ahead and take the second, Mark?
So with Lemon Duck, we saw this malware spreading through multiple different sites this quarter. Like I mentioned, it historically could come over a USB drive or exploits. These days, we see it showing up over email as well too. And one of the key factors with Lemon Duck infections, though, is once they infect your machine, they're always going to make a command and control connection back out to a domain or IP address under the attacker's control. And that is another area where you can potentially action and stop the attack from being able to carry on. Basically, if you can block that command and control traffic using something like DNS Watch, even if the machine is technically infected, you're preventing it from beaconing home and you can neuter the activity of the threat actor there. That said, you still have to act on those alerts that you'll get through your dashboard and make sure that you clean up that infection, because we've even seen recent news lately of threat actors going in and reviving almost decades old botnets by re-registering some of these domains and resetting up the infrastructure after the fact. So make sure you're paying attention to the alerts that you see for malware beaconing out of your network, and don't just assume because you blocked it, you're fully safe. Make sure you go back to that client and clean up the infection too.
And the final tip,
last one.
Yeah, just realize that phishing is evolving. Threat actors are getting much better at phishing and spear phishing. It's evolving in a lot of ways. Mark just talked about some. The fact that SharePoint.com offers client subdomains that you can, just by using SharePoint, you might have a link that has SharePoint in it. Threat actors can now use more convincing domains that look real as starting points. In a moment, we're going to let Mark talk about the story of the month, where you'll learn about proxying tools. When you have a phishing domain that's looking like Office 365, it's because for the most part, it is Office 365. What they might do is get your web traffic through that link you clicked on, but they're just redirecting the traffic to the real Microsoft site, and thus the pictures and the images and locations you'll see on the site look exactly like the real site, but you don't realize you're on a proxy for it, which is capturing all your credentials. And just all the tricksy techniques they use as far as adding JavaScripts to email and stuff. So just be aware phishing campaigns are really evolving. Why is this important? All these fancy zero-day network attacks are not the most likely way bad guys will break into your network. The most likely way is they're going to get one of your real users' credentials. And if you're not using multi-factor, once they have a real user's credential, they bypass most of your security because they can do whatever that user does, get inside the soft and chewy middle of your network and start to find even more privileged accounts. So just be aware of how phishing is evolving. And using that as a segue, why don't I hand it over to Mark to talk about our top security incident, which was Evil Proxy this Q3.
Yeah, so traditional phishing attacks that you would see targeting users, if they're not trying to convince you into opening up an attachment and executing malware on the machine, they're trying to get you to go visit a website disguised to look like some form of authentication and steal your username and password. And with traditional phishing, like over the past few years, it typically ended there. Like they would trick you into going to fakeoffice.com, you'd put in your username and password, and at that point, they have both those sets of credentials, and they'd go and try and log into your account. But if you were a good security practitioner, you were following best practices like using multi-factor authentication, at that point, they were stuck because they didn't have access to that secondary token that they need in order to authenticate into the account. In order to, so since then, though, we've seen them evolve, and now in order to get past some of those protections with MFA, we're seeing them use new strategies now that can allow them to circumvent some of those protections. And this really culminated in halfway through last year in July, as you see, with a forum post on a really popular underground hacking forum. That was someone advertising licensed access to this tool, which they called Evil Proxy. So Evil Proxy, in a nutshell, allows a threat actor to set up infrastructure disguised to look like a potential target, like Google or Microsoft or Dropbox or whatever. It sets up a authentication form disguised to look just like the traditional authentication form. But unlike those older style phishing, the way it's architected allows a threat actor to sit in the middle and intercept not just the username and password, but also a authenticated session cookie, letting them hop into your account right away. And so, Corey, you can hop on to the next slide. We'll go over a little bit of what that looks like. So how this all works is the threat actor, even a low-skilled attacker, can license out access to Evil Proxy, and all they have to do is go register a domain to look like whatever their intended target is. So if they're targeting office.com, maybe they go register office with 4 F's in it, .net, and use that in a phishing message sent to a victim. They host this toolkit on a website that they control, and so the victim, instead of connecting to the legitimate office.com, connects to the malicious threat actor's office with 4 extra F's in there. To the victim's perspective, it's all encrypted. The certificates check out. If they're not paying close attention to the different URL in their browser URL bar, to them, it looks like the legitimate Office website. To the legitimate Office website, the threat actor is proxying this connection, so effectively opening their own to that website. And so to office.com, the threat actor looks like the actual client in this situation. And what this means is when the victim enters in their username and password, the attacker is able to steal that right away, but then they also forward it on to the legitimate office.com. Office sees a valid username and password, and they generate the MFA request, whether that be sending a prompt down to the user or telling them to enter that 6-digit code that rotates every 30 seconds. And the attacker takes that and forwards it back down to the victim. So again, to the victim, this all looks legitimate still. They'll complete the MFA prompt, either hitting accept or entering the 6 digits from their phone, and that gets forwarded again through the attacker's website back to the legitimate office.com, which to their perspective now, they just passed username, password, and MFA token. So they generate a authenticated session cookie and send it back down through the attacker to the victim. So at this point, the attacker has
Well,
Yes.
I was going to say, even saying it another way, in this case, if you think about it, MFA technically wasn't hacked at all yet. It
Yep.
wasn't hacked, really. MFA was all legitimate. The attacker just acted as a pushing person. They can't force the MFA to get bypassed. The user has to legitimately accept it. But and they probably don't even see if it's a push authentication, some of the MFA prompts. So they haven't hacked MFA, but they've allowed it to happen through a mechanism where they can man in the middle, which I'm sure you'll get to the
Yep.
next part now.
So now they've got the username and the password and also this authenticated session cookie. So from the attacker's perspective, they can take that cookie, paste it into their own web browser and refresh the page. And now to Office.com's perspective, they are that authenticated client. And the first thing they're going to do is they'll go in and set up their own authenticator on the account so that they can maintain access with that username and password. Then they'll use the account maybe to carry out business email compromise against other users or use it as a launching point to attack the organization itself. And even worse, at the flip side of this, they forward on that same session cookie to the victim itself, and the victim gets redirected to the legitimate office.com. And so again, if you're not paying close attention, it looks like you just logged into office.com and you might not have even set off any alarm bells to go notify your IT or security team that you fell for a phish. Whereas the old style phishing,
Yeah.
because they couldn't get past MFA, you'd ultimately get to like a broken page or something that does look suspicious, and that might set off some alarm bells for you to go reset your password. So this style of attack used to be really difficult to carry out, but Evil Proxy and other copycat tools these days have entirely commoditized it. So from the attacker's perspective, you don't need to be a web development architect in order to set this up. You just need to pick a good phishing domain and craft a somewhat believable phishing email and send it to victims, and everything else is taken care of by the malware or architecture authors in this case. And it's really lowered the barrier for this style of attack, which makes it way more widespread against all organizations.
And by the way, we have a question here, Mark, I'll ask in a moment. But the thing, if you're a technical security person, you've known this forever. But the key thing here is that web-based session cookie. Once you get past the authentication, that web-based session cookie is all you need to quote unquote authenticate. What you're really doing is keeping the authentication session open, but is really all you need to authenticate until some other mechanism, resets that cookie. So this bypasses MFA, but it's not really an issue with MFA. It's going to happen no matter what kind of MFA you use, because almost every website has to have these session cookies to keep an authenticated user for a period of time. So the question, now that I've set that up, Mark, the question is, can something like Evil Proxy be used to bypass something like AuthPoint? And for instance, if you're logging into your AuthPoint SSO portal, that is a web-based authentication. And while our MFA will be strong for sure, the truth is, once you have a session cookie, you might be able to act as the user if you're able to capture that session cookie. So I think the answer is yes. It would require a bad guy to man in the middle and you in the first place, which is kind of hard unless especially if you're paying attention, but it's certainly possible. That said, Mark, I think maybe you could talk about what do sites do to mitigate this, to protect session cookies, or try to at least do things to kind of minimize their misuse from other actors.
So taking a step back and to reiterate some of what you said, like multi-factor authentication is a fantastic, in fact, the best tool to protect against a stolen or compromised credential. It means that just getting the username and password isn't enough to log into an account. Multi-factor authentication is not a perfect protection against social engineering, though. You still need to educate your users on how to spot phishing activity, because that is one way to circumvent MFA and other technical controls you have too. There are some things you'll see like number matching and other forms of MFA that make it a little more difficult to get past it. But the reality is we, at the end of the day, have to trust our users in order to not get tricked from threat actors, because if we've got the strongest technical controls in place, they're going to go after the weakest link, which is a uneducated user of your system. I did see another question here pop up, specifically mentioning SSL VPN. The good news is, with most VPN tools like SSL or IKE2, they do what's called mutual authentication, where it's authenticating both the client and the server, and it makes it significantly more difficult for a threat actor to man in the middle. to the point where in some implementations it can be almost impossible without malware running on the victim's machine itself to steal some of that authentication material from the client. So without getting too in the weeds, mobile VPNs tend to be safe from this style of attack. It's more of a web browser-based attack against victims, which means we just need to be training our users to spot phishing activity out there. Make sure you've got the right tools to teach them how to spot phishing activity, and then tools like DNS Watch and other DNS firewalling services to block those clicks that still get through.
We'll have to go through endpoint quickly, but it's good. I think this is an interesting subject, and we have another comment. I think the answer is more industry standard, but the question was, why aren't just session cookies somehow tied to a device? For instance, not just the user that logged into the website, but maybe if every device had public and private keys of its own, the session cookie could somehow be signed by the device too, so that no other device could use it. Do you know an answer? My assumption is just because that would require every device to have signing keys to do this, and everyone in the industry would have to update to allow for this. But do you have any thoughts on why we aren't just signing cookies, tying it to the computer or device they're generated on?
It's probably the lack of standard, like you just mentioned, but there are still some implementations that can help with this. So you'll see some websites, especially in the finance sector, tie your session to at least your IP address. But note that the reason we don't see that across the board everywhere is it does cause a significant amount of user friction. Like if you were to be on a VPN and then disconnect the VPN, suddenly you're unauthenticated from all the apps that you use. Same deal with if your dynamic public IP at home changes, that could cause issues too. And so security is always this balance of, like, we would love to be able to just unplug the internet and keep everyone from being hacked, but the reality is you still need to allow some activity. And so we need to balance user friction as well too when it comes to some of the security tooling. That said, as evil proxy and these tools become more widespread, I would expect to see more drives towards a industry standard like client signing of cookies as well in order to protect against some of these threats too.
And realize the one thing we're leaving out is pretty much every big website out there using session cookies has a lot of back-end protections for this, meaning user and entity behavioral analytics. So Mark already mentioned that the website could choose to tie the session cookie to the IP that originated it. They could also geo-region where the person was coming from, and if the same session cookie is used 2 seconds later from a totally different region, block that. A long story short, they do various behavioral analytics, at least the good smart sites do, to try to at least detect if someone is misusing session cookies. It's not perfect, but there are definitely protections that websites put that are probably invisible to the user, but you might get prompts to re-log in occasionally if they see something strange happening.
Yep. Very good discussions on that one, though. This is definitely the frontier of cyber threat activity out there, it feels like.
Very quickly, since we only have a few minutes left and want to cover, there's some questions we need to answer when we get to defenses. Now we're looking at the threats that we get from our endpoint products like WatchGuard EPDR or Adaptive Defense 360. Long story short, malware is actually still pretty high from an endpoint perspective. We've seen it go up a bit, and things like even ransomware has been up in Q3, I think almost close to our Q1 record we had for 2022. This chart shows the vector with which malware comes in, whether it's a script, whether it's some sort of Windows mechanism, whether it's a drive-by download using your browser, an Office document, it could be a graphics, something signed with a graphics driver, a PDF, and so forth. Lots of different mechanisms for how malware comes in. But the main takeaway of this slide is more often than not, we see malware start as a malicious script. And this kind of ties to what Mark talked about of living off the land attacks. It's not always the case, but we find the reason threat actors use living off the land attacks and try to make their malware as fileless as possible is because a lot of folks don't have the advanced endpoint detection and response capabilities to capture those techniques. And the scripts could be something like PowerShell that's very often legitimately run on a computer too. So it's probably an easy obfuscation technique for malware. As far as browsers, there's not a ton of drive-by download threats, at least in Q3. Only 3% of malware was delivered in browsers. When it is delivered in browsers, by the way, Internet Explorer still, not Edge, Internet Explorer and Firefox seem to have 43% and 39, the mass majority of detections are those two browsers, which is one old outdated one and a browser that I think is still good, Firefox, but maybe not the most popular. Meanwhile, Chrome is not the most common way. Others like Edge, Brave, Opera. Edge is a very popular browser, but so far it's not delivering a lot of malware, so maybe Microsoft's did better with protections. And browsers like Opera and Brave are probably just less popular. So anyways, the key takeaway here is a lot of script-based malware, probably because of living off the land attacks. I'll let Mark talk a little bit about crypto miners.
And one key trend from crypto miners is that the volume of them is going down. In fact, we saw a significant decrease in the number of detections this last quarter for cryptocurrency miners than we saw in previous ones. And a lot of this just tends to follow the fluctuations in overall, I hate using the word value because my own opinions are there's not a whole lot of value in cryptocurrency in general. But as the cost of a cryptocurrency goes up and down, as interest from the wider public goes up and down, we tend to see threat actors abusing cryptocurrency miners like that go up and down too. It's never going to go away entirely. As long as there is some monetary value tied to cryptocurrency, we will see cryptocurrency mining malware tied into traditional Trojans along the way too. But a focused effort on it does tend to decrease as value and interest in cryptocurrency decreases too in the overall marketplace. With that though, Corey, do you want to highlight some new interesting information from ransomware that we were able to add to the report?
Sure. First, I will just recap that ransomware overall was definitely up in Q3. Lockbit, which you've probably heard about before, a type of ransomware, was by far the most detected ransomware by a wide margin. It was detected a bit over 4 times more often than the second most common ransomware, which was Basta. So ransomware is up a little bit as far as our endpoint protection detections. Now, what you're seeing here is one of the people on our team is part of our malware analyst team, and he's been doing a research project where he's been following ransomware groups. So this is a list of a lot of different groups of ransomware. Some, like Lockbit, are called the name of their ransomware too. Some are just have their own group name. But we have been doing a lot of underground research, or he has, to be tracking these groups and finding where they have perhaps their public advertisement site where they might post new victims and share a proof of concepts of the data they stole, and pays attention to how many different victims they have been able to extort via the period of time. And here you can also see all the way at the bottom, Lockbit is the one that had many extortions during Q3. That number is the extortion count, not the amount we detected the ransomware. And this is data that he started tracking, and I'm talking futures here, but eventually you'll see a ransomware tracker being released by WatchGuard that's going to be maintained, where you'll always be able to see what these groups are doing, how many victims they've attained over different quarters and time periods, and we'll probably share samples of some of the data they're sharing to try to encourage those people to pay extortions. So a lot of interesting information. Hopefully by following the actual threat actor groups and putting a flashlight on them, we can start to get rid of them. Since we're running low on time, let's just end with takeaways really quickly and try to get a few of the remaining questions. The big takeaway here, as you can tell, besides the fact that there is a lot of malware and network attacks happening over encrypted traffic, the malware we see in encrypted traffic is also more sophisticated than average. But finally, I also believe a lot of the top lists you see in this report are probably not 100% accurate because so few people scan encrypted traffic. What all this means is unless you're doing something, whether it's a network level like decrypting encrypted traffic or an endpoint level where you at least have a chance to catch things when they decrypt on the endpoint, you could miss where all the attacks are happening. And as we start to lose visibility of that traffic, we may not have the full picture all the time. So the takeaway here is to turn on that feature if you can. Now, it's a free feature. We think it's relatively easy to use. 2 questions concerning it. One person said, doesn't something like that just defeat the purpose and break TLS traffic? Well, technically, this is a good guy man in the middle attack, but it doesn't break TLS traffic because we do it in a way that follows the TLS standard. So in order to set this up, for instance, on a network security appliance, you either have to send a certificate to all your clients, which we don't recommend, or you probably use something like Active Directory and can create a CA root certificate for your domain. For us, it would be watchguard.com. We can import a certificate into the Firebox that is part of that whole SSL TLS chain of trust. And by having that certificate on the Firebox, it does allow the Firebox to decrypt it without breaking the lock icon. From the chain of trust perspective, no bad adversary has looked at the traffic, which is true because the only people that have that corporate certificate are your employer, and potentially employees will be able to see it.
And one important bit on that too, Corey, is the Firebox itself maintains a list of trusted CA certificates just like your browser. And so it is making sure that upstream that certificate chain all checks out. And if it detects something like someone else man-in-the-middling out there, like actual malicious activity, it will intentionally break and cause a untrusted certificate warning on your browser to still protect your users from something happening upstream. So just because you're inspecting on the Firebox doesn't mean we're just re-signing everything all willy-nilly and making it so you don't have visibility into those threats out there too.
So you are a man in the middling, but you're man in the middling in a trusted, legitimate way, and it's only your office. It's only the owner of that additional CA cert that is allowed to see the traffic. The other thing you should know is this all happens on the Firebox. I don't even think we give you an option to keep it unencrypted. So we do decrypt it to scan it, but on the other end, it will get its encryption back, meaning even if internal users are trying to sniff traffic and see your banking connections, they won't be able to see it because it's encrypted even after it passes the firewall. So yes, technically a good guy is inserting an option to be able to see into the traffic, but it's limited only to the owner of the certificate, which you as the administrator have full control of adding to your Firebox. So it doesn't break the mechanisms that allow this to work. Now, one person did ask is it does seem to break some sites. I will say lots of things are happening in standards as far as TLS. There's things you can do like certificate pinning. Domains can force a certain certificate to be the one that's used. There's applications that you can get to through a web browser, but also have their own client application too. And when they have a client application, they may not be using the same certificate your browser certificate stores. So there's situations where you can set this up and use Dropbox over the web very well, but if you use the Dropbox client, things can happen. And that's why you do sometimes have to, if you set this up, you will find sites that you have to make exceptions for. That said, the person that asked this mentioned they had packet filters to help. We've really updated the HTTPS exception capabilities. There's some default pre-made exceptions you can turn on right away. So there's lots of different ways to make exceptions. But the truth is, we highly recommend you turn it on, but it won't be pain-free. There will be some sites where you will have to make an exception for it, and maybe some clients you have to make an exception for it. I still think it's worth it. I think some of what we've done in the client make it as easy as possible. I'm not sure how much easier it will get though, because you do have to do this properly for it not to break traffic. So I highly encourage you do it. Know that exceptions will have to be made, and at the very least, make sure you have endpoint security at the end to catch your encrypted stuff too. Why don't you take the next one?
And I won't spend much time on this one since we already went over a lot of the reasons why piracy is not great for an organization, one of them being it is completely illegal. But the key point is when you're designing your cybersecurity policy for your company, make sure you explicitly call out the risks of piracy within the organization as a cybersecurity threat. Make sure that your users understand that pirating software, it's not just the legal risk of being caught for copyright infringement or other malicious or illegal activity. They do tend to come tainted with malware and other malicious activity in them. So making sure you call this out in your policy is a great way to also help your overall organization's cybersecurity. With that, Corey, you want to grab the last one real quick?
Yeah, and the last one is just have a business continuity disaster recovery plan. That will be your plan Z. This tip makes more sense if you read the intro of our report where I talk about contingency planning. The best plan always has issues. As soon as you get on a battlefield, you've seen all the movies where someone plans a heist or some sort of an attack. Something always goes wrong and they have to adjust their plan because you're never going to have the perfect defense that fixes everything. And that's why, the final part of that plan is making sure you can survive a successful attack. So have some sort of business continuity plan that allows you to make sure you can quickly move all your important digital assets that provide your business its capabilities to some other place quickly, and that if you have things like ransomware, you have backups, you have something that will quickly recover, you have servers that can virtually spin up. We want to prevent everything before it happens, but you always need a plan B, C, and D, so make sure BCDR is your final plan. With that, I know we're quite a bit over. There's some of the questions are a little throwaway, but why don't we go through a few quickly? There's one I'm not sure I understand, Mark, but one person asked, what can we do to avoid leaks as we have many search pages and the security is not at the same level? I'm not sure exactly what they
Try and
mean by
interpret
that.
this maybe as like indexing public pages and avoiding leaks through like company data that may be exposed. But I don't know. The way I potentially interpret this is basically just make sure you understand the footprint of your data and systems. Do a data and asset inventory regularly within your organization, and then make sure you've got security controls in place to potentially block leaks of that data out there onto the internet as your users are interacting with it. I'm not sure if you're able to clarify. Maybe we can get to that a little bit more thoroughly too. There was one question, or I guess two HTTPS decryption related questions I wanted to hit. So one of them was, what is the potential impact to resources on the device? So I believe at this point, all of the Firebox appliances have some form of dedicated hardware to help with the decryption and re-encryption of traffic. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's free on the device, but the impact is lower than you would probably suspect, especially on our hardware specifically. There's been industry tests. I can't remember who the latest variant of NSS Labs is, but you can see how we perform against others in the industry too. And it is one area that we've really focused on lately, is making sure that you can decrypt your traffic with minimal impact to the load on your device. And there was another related question of, why do we not recommend installing clients certificates on clients? It's not that we don't recommend it. There's no security weakness. It's just managing a single certificate on the Firebox to your domain versus managing multiple certificates on each of your clients.
It's purely ease of setup. I mean, you literally have to go to all the web browsers that you use and import that single certificate. Yeah, group policy can help with Internet Explorer and Edge, but what if some of your users use Firefox or Chrome? You'd have to import the certificate there too. Then you have the browsers covered, but what about other applications that might actually be using 443 TLS for them too? So the point is, you can certainly do client certificates, no problem, but you have mobile devices, you have IoT where you can't really import certificates. So this idea of having to push them to every single client, that I can understand why people don't avoid setting up HTTPS decryption, because that's a lot of work to maintain and has gaps for the devices where you can't easily import them. Meanwhile, importing the actual full corporate certificate into your Firebox is one simple thing that you can do right away, and it will cover every single thing that's coming from that domain or network. So it's just purely ease, as Mark said, nothing to do with it being technically worse. One question, someone mentioned that they've seen some experts talking about how you can set up systems where even if end users' credentials are compromised, the security system will compensate for their mistakes. I'm not sure exactly what the security system compromises for their mistakes, but the first thing is MFA. That's the whole point of MFA. We highly recommend you use something like Authpoint MFA, because even if someone gets a password, it's not the end of the world. MFA, they still have to get past MFA. That said, there's other things too, where these experts may have been going was something that I mentioned in passing, the acronym called UBA, User and Entity Behavioral Analytics. So because we do know that threat actors do sometimes get credentials and are able to try to start pretending to be a user, there's a lot of security controls that pay attention to behaviors over time. When does Corey log into Facebook? From what regions? How often? What are the types of things he searches? And then if you see, you set up a baseline of what users typically do. I use Facebook as an example, but it could be any business application. You can start to generate a profile. And whenever there's anomalies, that's when you might tell this user is acting very out of character for Corey. Let's do something about it. Maybe ask them to re-authenticate, and not only re-authenticate, but re-authenticate with stronger second factor tokens too. So that's what those experts are right. It's very good to have MFA and anything else that will help you catch a potential malicious user that's spoofing a legitimate one. But I think MFA is the easiest way to do that before you even get into UBA.
And the last question I see in here revolves around web blocker URL exceptions on the Firebox. And the way I interpret it is there a way to template out exceptions so that you can use them in multiple policies without having to re-add them as you modify them across the Firebox? I'd say that is a fantastic idea for a feature that I don't believe exists right now. And I will absolutely bring that to product management's attention because I like that idea of being able to update a single group or template for exceptions and plug and play it across the Firebox. Because the reality is, as we use more tools like HTTPS inspection, we'll want to make sure that we have ease of use baked into it as well too. So great suggestion.
And I think you'll find WatchGuard Cloud Management will have a lot of templating and scale management type features coming to it. So great suggestion, agreed. With that, thank you for attending. Also, thank you for the folks that stuck around an extra 12 minutes. Thought it was useful because it's always best to talk about your direct questions and not just our content. If you want to keep up with us, I highly recommend going to Secplicity. You can find our report here, but you can find a lot of other stuff too. And with that, thank you guys. I hope you have a fantastic and lovely Tuesday.
Thank you, everyone.